Good morning. I'm Pastor Elaine Siemsen, and I'm going to bring a message to you this morning about our gospel reading from Matthew. And I'm doing so from my garden here in Rochester, Minnesota. When I read the gospel lesson, it seemed so obvious that I should talk to you about a garden, and I could easily picture myself in my own. So maybe you can picture yourself in your garden. My garden is a little bit challenging. When we purchased our home 3 years ago, it had been empty for 13 years. And so large garden areas had been ignored for most of that time. And as I looked at them, I was just amazed by all the stuff that was growing. It was really hard to tell what was intentional and what was sort of self-invited, accidental. Like, was that tree really supposed to be there? And what's that lilac bush doing growing in the middle of a pine tree out in the yard? But I enjoy my garden, and every day is sort of that never-ending task that I can walk by any one of the beds and pull up a handful of weeds. So I sort of have constantly dirty fingers as I pass by the flower beds. But there is a danger. I'm not always sure what it is that I'm pulling up, especially with the things that I didn't plant and have been here for a number of years. Now that's a good tie-in to Matthew's gospel reading for this morning, the parable of the wheat and the weeds, or if you're old enough like me, you might have learned it as the parable of the wheat and the tares. The owner in the story, in the parable, plants good seed, good wheat seed out in the field. And as time passes and the wheat begins to come up, the slaves are absolutely horrified to realize that weeds have invaded the field and have filled the wheat field with as many weeds, it seems, as there is wheat. The weeds weren't in the plan, either of the gardener, the owner, or of the slaves, and they are certainly offended by it, both owner and slaves. So what should be done? What do they do about these weeds growing up among the wheat? Well, the slave solution is to tear out those offensive plants as fast as possible, removing them from the field. I found myself wondering why it was so important to the servants, to the slaves, that the weeds be torn up with such immediacy and maybe with some degree of violence. And I thought about what my garden looks like and the disorder that the weeds bring to it. Maybe the slaves looked at the field of wheat and saw the disrupted rows and the neat plantings that the weeds brought to the wheat. There's also a concern about the crop. The servants seem to believe that the weeds will damage the wheat in some way, that they are bad for the crop. I can certainly understand that. As they grow in my garden, I think they're suffocating some small plant and I pull them up quickly. But maybe for the servants, there's also a bit of desire for power. It's really very powerful to be the one who moves along the garden and rips those things out of there and throws them aside, knowing that they're going to the burn pile, or in our case, to the back area. There's a great deal of power in being the one to tear out the weeds. Now, the servants seem to be bursting with energy to go be eradicators of the weeds, but the master seems to be much more hesitant and maybe have some other ideas. This landowner doesn't seem to directly challenge the servants about their ideas of tearing out the weeds, but there seems to be the unspoken question of them. Can you really tell the difference between the wheat and the weeds? That's not such an obvious thing to do. Very often, wheat and weeds seem to look a great deal alike, or in my garden, the flowers and the weeds look a great deal alike. In one of my houses, I planted a prairie garden, and my neighbors often referred to my plants as weeds because they didn't seem to know the difference between the crabgrass growing in the yard and the ironweed or the rattlesnake master growing in the garden. Sometimes the weeds and the wheat can't be told apart. They look too much alike. Sometimes the weeds are actually more attractive. They seem to grow faster. They do in my garden. It seems like the weeds are the first things that pop up. And if they're pretty and they look healthy, it certainly would be understandable if the servants might pull up the wrong thing, mistaking the healthy weed as opposed to a small and less mature wheat. I know how much it is that they can look alike. Early in this spring, there were these tall, skinny, leaved things coming up all over our yard. They were in the back and all over the grass and in the flower beds, and I thought, oh, drat, I've got some kind of strange weed growing everywhere. But I decided just to leave them alone and figured when we started to mow the grass, we would cut them down. I'm grateful that I did leave them alone, for they weren't weeds at all. About a month later, we were treated to a beautiful display of bluebells blooming in the garden. Sometimes the wheat and the weeds look alike. And sometimes, in our haste to eradicate the evil weeds from the garden, we do a lot of damage. We uproot the healthy plant trying to get the weed out. I know how easy that is with like native prairie grasses. Other kinds of things grow up right through the middle, and it's almost impossible to pull them out without uprooting the entire plant. So sometimes in our haste, we do more damage than we do good. But we all know Matthew isn't really offering us a lesson on plant identification or on gardening and how to keep our gardens orderly. This isn't an encouragement on how we should be weeding our vegetable plots more often. If we want to understand what the parable has to do with us, we just need to jump to those end verses where Jesus talks to the disciples about the meaning of the parable. This really is more than a lesson about plants growing in a farmer's field. It's about us, about humans, and how we grow alongside each other in God's kingdom. Jesus is teaching the disciples a number of lessons, but a couple of them came to attention to me as I read it. The first is, Jesus is constantly reminding the disciples that they are not the ones who will decide between what is weed and what is wheat, or as Jesus calls it, the good seed and the evil seed. That's not the job of the disciples to make that decision, to make that call about which should be eradicated. Because you see, the disciples and us, more often than not, can't tell the difference. We don't recognize the good in the good seed that God has planted in other people. We think we see the evil in them. So Jesus is first of all reminding the disciples that we're not the ones who will make the decision about which is weed and which is wheat. That's God's, for God is the one who has done the planting. Another lesson that I think Jesus is reminding the disciples of is how quick they are to judge. The disciples were quite quick to judge the Pharisees and the Sadducees as being evil and undermining the ministry of Jesus. And yet it was Joseph of Arimathea who comes to Jesus by night seeking guidance and who offers a tomb for his burial. It's Matthew, the tax collector, who would have been ousted by the disciples in earlier days, who becomes one of their trusted members. Jesus is reminding the disciples that they're too often too quick to judge. Neither of those are very easy lessons for either the servants to learn or for us to learn. We really like to be in charge, and we'd like to be the ones who are choosing what is wheat and what is weed. We'd like to believe that we know and can recognize the good seed in each other and the evil seed in some. But Jesus tells us no, those are not our jobs. So then why does he tell the parable? Is it just supposed to chastise the disciples? And then there's that end part about the end times. I believe something else that Jesus is teaching us. We shouldn't get so caught up in these images and visions of destruction. God has a plan, and there is a plan for an end time, but it shouldn't be the focus of our lives, nor should it have been the focus of the lives of the disciples. When we focus on the evil, when we focus on the not good seed, we damage ourselves. We bring our hearts and our consciousness and our souls into that discussion, hurting ourselves, and then we ultimately hurt others. So I believe Jesus tells the example and explains the parable to warn the disciples, don't get caught up in that destructive stuff. Stay away from that. I also believe that Jesus is encouraging us to slow down. In our eagerness to name evil, in our eagerness to push away that which we don't believe is God's, in our eagerness to protect and create order in our world, we create pain and sorrow for each other. When we slow down, we give more conversation time, we pay better attention to each other. And I also believe Jesus tells the story of the good seed because he wants to calm their fears. It was a very anxious time for the disciples, just as it's an anxious time for us now. And by promising to all of us that there is good seed, and it is plentiful, for God has scattered good seed all around the creation, among more people than we may ever meet, our fears should be calmed. This is a good world, and God is in charge, and the seed has been sown by the Son. So it's a parable that sounds a little odd, but it reminds us that God is the master gardener, not us. And God has a plan that may not be very obvious to us, and that there is a timeline, and that we don't always recognize the weeds from the wheat, or the good in each other from that which might be harmful. So for me, this becomes a parable of assurance and hope. I can still keep my fingers dirty here in the garden, pulling out weeds from time to time. Just as in my own life, I can spend time looking for hope and compassion and faith rather than anger or fear. And I can trust that God is and will take care of all the rest. Amen.